Chapter 9 The Destiny is Forged by Blood and Steel. POV Killian Didoldia. The rainy season was approaching. My nose itched, and the wind carried the scent of wet earth mixed with the fragrance of trees. Whenever that smell came, it meant the storm was near. It was familiar, but today it felt different, heavier, almost suffocating. While practicing fire magic, a flame dancing in my hand, I glanced at Rigger. He was sitting near the edge of the clearing, as sharp as ever, carefully adjusting his sword. I'd seen him do this before, but today it felt like he was elsewhere. His eyes gleamed with determination, but there was something more. Concern, perhaps? Rigger was never like us. From the day I saw him leaping through the trees at just 2 years old, he already seemed different. Not just because he was astonishingly strong and talented. He was more, not in size, but in what he represented. He always knew what to do, always had a plan, even when everyone else was confused. When he stood, everyone stopped to watch. I remember the day he started training us. I had just turned 4, barely knowing anything about life. That towering figure became my teacher. I would have called him master, but he firmly forbade it. From that moment, I followed him wherever he went, except during his own training. When he wasn't around, we trained and played together, our group roaming the village under Rigger's banner. No other group of kids dared to challenge us, and we eventually absorbed any rivals into our own circle. Even with this new, larger group, Rigger always remained impartial and fair, resolving every problem and complaint with ease. My respect and admiration for him grew each day. Then came the day when Rigger was officially recognized as a warrior of the tribe, not just for his power, but also for his intellect and maturity. I heard he had defeated his father, one of the strongest warriors in the village. That day, we celebrated as if the achievement was our own. Despite his new responsibilities, he never abandoned us. Not that anyone expected him to. He could do it all, and he never made mistakes. I think it was on that day that I realized my goal. I was learning magic, and my parents and friends already found that impressive enough. But what Rigger was teaching me was a unique skill, one that I might never fully master. You could do it, Killian. Just guide your mana naturally, Rigger said, pointing at my chest, and then my hand. Let it flow like a river. Don't try to control it all at once. And it worked. For the first time, I created a ball of water, small and fragile, without using any incantation. He smiled, and in that moment, I knew I wanted to follow him. I felt that this was my path, my destiny. As long as I followed him, everything would be fine. Since then, Rigger has become like a demigod in my eyes. Lysena, Taze, and I, along with the other division leaders, always looked to him for direction. And he always gave it. Even when things seemed grim, he found a way forward. Today, as I watch him, I realize he has changed. There's something heavier about him, more serious. The responsibility he carries is immense. Yet even so, he doesn't falter. As I observed him, Lysena approached. "Killian, what are you looking at?" she asked, her voice curious, a faint smile on her face. "Rigger," I replied, my voice quieter than I expected. "Are you worried about him?" I thought for a moment before answering. "No, I want to help him in any way I can." Lysena fell silent, but I could tell she felt the same way. We weren't just as students. Rigger was our leader. That day, I made a silent vow. No matter what happened, I would stand by him. Because deep down, I knew he was more than just a boy. He was Rigger, and Rigger would make a difference. MC's POV. The room was quiet, save for the sound of blades being sharpened and the occasional crackle of the firewood in the hearth. Fendrell stood against the log wall of the cabin, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on me. Irina sat beside him. Darian stood on the other side, spinning a knife between his fingers, his relaxed demeanor contrasting with the tension in the air. The two were inseparable, childhood friends. Whenever they spoke of each other, there was a camaraderie I envied. They seemed so synchronized, so human. Beyond them, the rest of the adventurers were scattered around the tent. Fendrell spoke first, breaking the silence. "So, Rigger, you're saying Guys is leading a direct assault on the enemy bases before the rainy season hits?" "Yes," I replied firmly. "We'll need your help again to defend the tribe. alongside the warriors stationed here, of course. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Zen's mouth twitch slightly as he heard me. Fendrell narrowed his eyes, studying me. He was quite the actor. Even I almost believed his facade. It was a bold, risky plan, but it had a high chance of success if executed well. Darien chuckled, his tone light but tinged with admiration. You've got guts, no doubt about it. But, Fendrell, do you think they'll fall for it? These slavers aren't amateurs. It's a risk, I admitted, keeping my voice steady, but a calculated one. They might still hesitate to attack because of the presence of a sword saint. Fendrell walked to the table in the center of the room, placing his hands on it and leaning forward. He seemed to weigh every detail, glancing at his companions to gauge their thoughts. Finally, he sighed and nodded. All right, we'll do it. We'll do our best to protect the tribe in their absence. I nodded, swallowing the tension rising in my chest. I followed him silently, keeping myself hidden among the trees. Zen was careful, but not careful enough to lose me. He walked quickly, his eyes scanning the ground ahead as if afraid of being followed. And, rightly so, I thought. My breathing was steady, my footsteps light. It was dark, but my eyes adjusted easily to the dim light, a gift of my race. Still, I knew that if Zen turned at the wrong moment, he might see me. He paused for a moment, tilting his head slightly. I crouched low, pressing my body to the ground, and held my breath. He glanced around, suspicious, but soon continued on his way. He left what appeared to be a letter inside a hollow log before moving on. When I was sure he was far enough away, I headed back to the village. When I arrived, I gathered Killian, Lysena, and Taze along with Erat and Leone, the other two division commanders. They were waiting, their faces a mix of excitement and fear. Listen, I began, my voice firm. You cannot reveal yourselves, no matter what happens. Stay hidden until I give the signal. And if something goes wrong, we run to the forest, Killian finished, his eyes shining with determination. I nodded. Exactly. Protect the other children. And don't look back. No matter what you hear, don't stop. They nodded in unison, and I felt an immense weight settle on me. Before leaving, I went to my mother. She was organizing items in the cabin, likely trying to keep herself occupied. Mom, I called, and she turned to me, her face weary. Don't worry about me. Just stay safe. She hesitated, her eyes filling with concern. But finally, she nodded and pulled me into a hug. Her warmth gave me strength I hadn't realized I needed. Hantar, Guys, Geru, and several other warriors stood in a tense circle, their expressions grim. Gustav repeated the plan, detailing every movement with precision. Zen has delivered the false information. This should give us the advantage we need. When the battle begins, Rigger will launch a large-scale ice attack to destabilize them. I need all of you ready to strike as soon as their formation breaks. What about the enemy's strongest warriors? Any new information? Hanar asked, his concern evident. Gustav took a deep breath. They're the biggest threat. We know Fendrell is here, but the slavers don't seem to fear him. That means they have something, or someone they believe can counter him. Guys clenched his fists. If they have a saint-level warrior, we can handle it, Gustav interrupted. Our losses might be greater, but no single man can stand against an army of warriors alone. I watched the discussion, conflicted. What if I lost control? It had happened before, and the fear of it haunted me. But I couldn't fail, not now. Days passed. The warriors had departed on an expedition to eliminate the slavers. To make the ruse convincing, none of the families had been informed. The farewells were somber and heart-wrenching. I was now secretly standing guard at the edge of the tribe's territory, keeping my magic eye active and scanning for any movement in the distance. Suddenly, I spotted dozens of mana signatures approaching. I quickly sent a signal to alert everyone to prepare. Moments later, I sensed a presence. Fendrell emerged from the main trail, followed by Darien and several other warriors from the tribe. They were armed and ready for battle, but something felt off about Darien. He seemed uneasy. The rest of our group will launch an ambush on their rear, Darien said, his voice laced with confidence and a faint smirk. Fendrell nodded. his gaze sharp as it locked onto mine through the underbrush. I returned the gesture, signaling that we were ready. The moment the enemy entered the clearing, we would begin our attack. "We're under attack. Gather all warriors now," Fendrel shouted, his voice commanding. The guards sprang into action, preparing for the assault. Despite everything going according to plan, my instinct screamed that something was wrong. The invaders advanced through the forest, torches and swords in hand, setting fires wherever they passed. They were well organized, their threatening silhouettes cutting through the forming mist. Dozens of them marched, but my attention was drawn to the central group. 5 swordsmen who walked with absolute confidence. They were different. Their posture, their aura, it all screamed lethality. Dressed in dark clothing accented with silver, each carried a longsword. They moved like shadows, their grace unnerving. Now wasn't the time to dwell on their strength. I gathered all the mana I could, feeling it surge and vibrate through my veins. The ground beneath me began to freeze, a thin layer of ice spreading outward as the air around me grew frigid. Taking a deep breath, I bent my knees and leaped into the air with all my might. Time seemed to slow as I soared upward. Below, the slavers turned their heads, confused, watching the shadow streak across the sky. "What is that?" someone shouted in alarm. At the apex of my jump, I raised my hand above my head, channeling all the mana I could muster into a single spell. A brilliant blue orb formed, pulsating with freezing energy and casting an eerie light across the shadowed forest. "Freezing Nova!" I roared, my voice reverberating with power. It wasn't the actual spell. I hadn't learned it yet, but it seemed close enough to what it would be. The orb detonated as it hit the ground, unleashing a blinding explosion of ice. A wave of frost radiated outward, shards of ice raining down like spears, impaling the ground and catching unprepared enemies. The temperature plummeted instantly, and a swirling blizzard enveloped the battlefield, leaving a pristine, cutting whiteness in its wake. When I landed, the impact cracked the frozen ground beneath me, sending out another shockwave of frost. Trees creaked and shattered, transformed into crystalline sculptures of ice. Many slavers screamed, trying to flee, but the cold claimed them before they could escape. A significant portion of the enemy was caught in the storm, frozen in place with their terrified expressions preserved in ice. As expected, the 5 swordsmen dodged the attack effortlessly, retreating before it struck. One of them stepped forward, the leader, by his demeanor. He unsheathed his blade, a crooked smile playing on his face, though his eyes were calculating. I glared at them, unflinching, while the guards began their counterattack against the invading forces. The sounds of clashing steel and roaring voices filled the clearing. Fendrel and Darien approached me. "What do we know about them?" I asked without taking my eyes off the 5 figures. "They're known as the Black Frost 5, Fendrel said grimly. "Infamous mercenaries in the underworld. They've never failed a job, but they're only advanced-level swordsmen." I swallowed hard. Black Frost. The name felt like a cruel irony, given my reliance on ice magic. The apparent leader stepped forward. He had long brown hair and a jagged scar running diagonally across his face, making him appear almost grotesque. His voice was clear and sharp as he addressed Fendrel. "Fendrel, it's been a while." Fendrel narrowed his eyes, but remained calm. "Resorting to working with slavers now? I'm not impressed." The swordsman chuckled. "We do what's necessary. And you? Come to die alongside these fur balls." I was prepared for their provocations. It was a common tactic in the North God style, but my instincts screamed louder than ever. Something was wrong, horribly wrong. I scanned the battlefield, using every sense at my disposal. The fights around me were chaotic, but didn't justify the danger I felt. It wasn't these 5. Their strength alone wouldn't provoke such a reaction. Deciding not to take chances, I signaled the hidden warriors to attack prematurely. Just as I felt a fleeting sense of safety, it happened. The enemy leader charged at Fendrel, wielding what I recognized as a long sword of silence. The choice seemed absurd, given his opponent. Fendrel appeared wary, his eyes darting to the other four swordsmen. He activated his ultimate technique, the long sword of light. Seeking a swift death? I'll oblige, he said coldly. But before I could react, Darien moved. He was behind Fendrel in an instant, his blade slicing through the air toward his childhood friend's back. Fendrel, behind you! I shouted, acting on instinct. My warning came just in time. Fendrel deflected the strike and twisted his body, narrowly avoiding being cleaved in half. However, Darien's blade continued, severing Fendrel's dominant arm and slicing off his right ear. Blood sprayed across the snow as Fendrel stumbled back, clutching the bleeding stump where his arm had been. Darien, Fendrel gasped, disbelief etched across his face. Darien showed no remorse. His expression was cold, his eyes devoid of emotion. I'm sorry, old friend, but the world is cruel. Rage erupted within me, wild and unrelenting. Before I knew it, I was hurtling toward Darien, moving faster than I ever had. The mercenary leader smirked as he watched the chaos unfold. Looks like the real show has begun. Chapter 10, Prey or Predator. The metallic scent of blood mingled with the humid air of the forest. Darien faced Rigor, raising his sword. His eyes, once brimming with the confidence of an experienced warrior, now faltered under the predatory stance of the young Doldia. Rigor moved forward, low and fluid like a predator stalking its prey. He feinted a strike with his sword to Darien's left, aiming for the mercenary's abdomen, but at the last moment, he twisted his torso and slashed toward Darien's neck. Darien's blade rose to block, its steel glinting under the sunlight filtering through the trees. The clash rang out in the clearing, but the strike was a decoy. In the same motion, Rigor planted his foot and spun, releasing his sword in midair in a North God-style technique, and delivered a devastating kick to Darien's stomach. The mercenary leader was hurled backward like a stone, flying several meters before crashing against a tree. The wood groaned, and Darien collapsed to his knees, coughing and clutching his abdomen. Rigor caught his sword as it fell, his gaze fixed on his target. Before he could strike again, a commanding voice broke through the tension. Rigor, don't advance alone. Fendrel, wounded, clutched his severed arm while shouting with effort. His voice stirred something within Rigor, briefly pulling him back to rationality. Rigor blinked, the world around him realigning. Quickly, he reached Fendrel's side and cast healing magic to stop the bleeding. He lamented his lack of advanced healing magic, which could have reattached the arm if the wound were fresh. He tried pushing the limits of intermediate healing magic, but to no avail. While Rigor paused to regain focus, Darien staggered to his feet, still clutching his pained stomach. You're as impressive as ever, Rigor, Darien spat, a mocking smile on his lips. Why, Darien? Is there a good reason for this? Are they threatening the rest of our group? Fendrel asked, hope evident in his voice. The rest of the group is safe, secured somewhere, Darien replied. I don't have time for a melodramatic explanation. We're short on time after all. Before Fendrel could respond, the remaining 5 Black Frost mercenaries began to encircle him and Rigor. But if you need a summary, Darien continued, it's about always living in your shadow, being weaker, slower, less talented. When we formed our adventurer group, you were the undeniable leader. When the woman of my dreams joined, she chose you. Call me crazy or whatever you want, but this job pays more than we've earned in all our adventures combined. Enough for me to live in peace with Arena and the others in the north. Without you. But don't worry, our friendship was real. I'll make sure they know you died a hero. His tone was cold, but the emotion in his eyes betrayed him. Fendrel crumbled, his last hope crushed mercilessly. How touching, one mercenary sneered, sharpening his blade against his hand. Let's wrap this up, kid. The sound of snapping branches and rustling leaves filled the air. One by one, the Didoldia warriors emerged from the shadows. Guys led the charge, sword in hand and a deathly glint in his eyes. Rats like you should never have entered this forest, Guys said, his voice low and menacing. Hantar appeared beside him, his fists clenched and his claws already stained with the blood of earlier battles. More Didoldia warriors emerged, surrounding the mercenaries with deadly precision. Why didn't they attack our bases? Isn't that what Zen told us? One mercenary muttered, his gaze darting nervously. Something went wrong. Another replied, but before they could act, Guys raised his sword and shouted, "Advance!" The battlefield erupted into chaos. Guys charged first, targeting two mercenaries with surprising speed. He swung his sword in a horizontal arc, forcing them to retreat. Before they could recover, he roared, releasing a howling magic that stunned them. Seizing the opening, he struck diagonally, his blade slicing through one mercenary from shoulder to chest. Across the clearing, Hantar fought with raw power and precision. He punched a mercenary in the face, breaking his nose with a single blow. When another tried to attack from behind, Hantar spun, grabbing the man's arm and snapping it before slamming him into the ground with his claws. In the center of the battle, Rigger regained his confidence. Leaving the unconscious Fendrel in a safe spot, he rejoined the fray. He moved like a blur, using earth magic to create small protrusions under his enemy's feet, throwing them off balance before striking. One mercenary tripped and fell, and Rigger pounced, driving his sword into the man's throat in a diagonal slash that spilled blood onto the forest floor. Another enemy, wielding two daggers dripping with poison, approached. Rigger backed off, watching the man's swift movements. Using wind magic to boost his speed, he dodged an attack, spinning to the enemy's back. With a sharp movement, he whispered a spell, Wind Blade. The magical slash tore through the mercenary's body, leaving him screaming on the ground. Despite the Didoldia warriors' advantage, the Black Frost mercenaries were no ordinary foes. Two of them, masters of the North God style, fought side by side. Their blades moved in swift, precise arcs, cutting down Didoldia warriors as they advanced. One of them targeted Guys, who blocked the strikes but was slowly pushed back by their relentless assault. "Rigger, with me!" Guys called out as he fended off a series of rapid attacks. Rigger noticed the mercenary pressing Guys, his blade moving with practiced precision. Guys was forced to retreat step by step, and the mercenary, confident, surged forward for a decisive overhead strike. Without hesitation, Rigger charged to assist. He conjured earthen spikes beneath the enemy's feet, forcing him to leap to avoid the attack. The brief pause gave Guys enough time to recover his stance and strike, but the mercenary easily blocked it, spinning to deliver a quick blow to Rigger's side as he closed the distance. The impact was weaker than expected, as Rigger caught the strike with sheer force. He countered with a kick to the enemy's knee, causing him to stagger and creating an opening for Guys to unleash his howling magic. The spell hit directly, disorienting the mercenary, who clutched his ears as the deafening sound reverberated. Also stunned, but already accustomed to the magic's effects, Rigger seized the moment of vulnerability and dealt the final blow. He leapt forward, his blade slicing cleanly through the mercenary's neck. The opponent collapsed to the ground, his sword clattering against the stones. As the remaining mercenaries struggled to hold their ground, one of them, scanning the battlefield, realized what was happening. They knew everything. "We were deceived," he shouted, eyes wide as he looked at Darien. But Darien was as bewildered as the rest. Even so, he raised his sword and snarled, "It doesn't matter. Keep fighting. Fendrel is injured. We can still turn this around." Despite his words, the tide of battle had shifted in the Doldia's favor. Every move reminded the intruders that the forest was their home, while the mercenaries were unwelcome invaders. One by one, the enemies fell to claws, swords, and magic. Soon, another of the Black Frost Five was slain, Lonar, the guard captain, driving his blade into the man's chest. Darien and the remaining three mercenaries began retreating, their bodies covered in cuts and bloodstains. However, as they fled, one of them left an opening, which Lonar confidently exploited. But it was a feint. As his blade was about to strike, a hidden dagger flew, embedding itself in Lonar's eye. Rigger watched in horror as his ally fell, the knife lodged in his skull, his eyes glazing over in pain. Something primal stirred within Rigger. The growl that escaped his throat was deep and feral. His eyes locked onto the fleeing enemies, and his fists clenched until his nails drew blood. He no longer thought. Rage clouded his mind. He could only feel. Do not pursue. We've already taken down most of them. This is our victory, Guys declared. The hurried footsteps of the fleeing mercenaries echoed through the clearing, snapping branches and crushing dry leaves. Lonar's body lay motionless on the ground, blood pooling beneath him. Rigger dropped his sword and knelt beside his fallen friend, already knowing it was too late. "Lonar," he whispered, his voice heavy with pain and anger. A Doldia warrior placed a hand on his shoulder. "Rigger, we—" But he didn't hear. A deep roar tore from his throat as he sprang to his feet, his gaze fixed on the retreating mercenaries. His beast instincts took over, and his mind was consumed by a single thought: hunt. He sprinted into the forest, his senses heightened by his fury. Every heartbeat of the enemies ahead drummed in his ears, calling him to battle. His magical eyes pulsed, capturing every movement, every labored breath from his prey. Rigger extended his hand, summoning earth magic. The ground beneath one mercenary surged upward, forming a pillar that slammed him into a tree. The impact was brutal, and before the man could recover, Rigger was upon him. Without hesitation, Rigger drove his claws into the man's chest, tearing through light armor. With a feral motion, he ripped upward, rending flesh and metal. The mercenary crumpled, gasping, until a final slash across his throat ended him. Farther ahead, another mercenary turned to face him. This one wielded a long sword with refined technique, likely trained in the North God style. He advanced, delivering swift, precise thrusts, but Rigger dodged each strike with instinctive movements. The mercenary attempted a horizontal slash, but Rigger deftly closed the distance, twisting his arm and slamming him into the ground. Rigger grabbed his neck. "You're not escaping." With sheer brute strength, he snapped the man's neck like a twig. By then, the Doldia warriors had caught up to him. Guys roared, unleashing his howling magic, sending shockwaves through the forest. The remaining mercenaries staggered, disoriented by the impact. But Rigger felt the shockwave too, though to a lesser degree. His body tensed, and his mind, already frayed by the frenzy, betrayed him. He turned toward Guys, his glowing eyes filled with unbridled rage. All he registered was the pain caused by the magic, and Guys became a target. Before anyone could react, Rigger lunged at his ally. He struck with his claws. Guys dodged instinctively, but still suffered a deep slash to his neck, narrowly avoiding a fatal wound. Another warrior tried to intervene, but Rigger spun, elbowing him into a tree with bone-cracking force. "Rigger, control yourself," shouted Hantar, his father, stepping between his son and the other warriors. Rigger growled low, advancing with claws raised. Hantar didn't back down. When the strike came, he sidestepped, but not enough to avoid it entirely. Rigger's claws tore into his left arm, blood dripping down the older warrior's forearm. The sight of his father's blood momentarily froze Rigger. His breaths came in ragged gasps, and his eyes flickered between fury and shock. "You're not an animal. Control yourself, Rigger," Hantar said firmly, his voice steady despite the pain. Sanity flickered back into Rigger's mind, albeit briefly. He stepped back, staring at his blood-stained claws and the wound on Hantar's arm. The sound of the fleeing mercenaries, however, pulled his attention again. He was not in control. His rationality teetered on the edge. He was afraid he might kill someone if he stayed. "I'm in control now," he told himself, but hadn't he said the same before? "Don't follow me." Before anyone could stop him, Rigger darted into the forest, chasing after the enemies alone. The remaining mercenaries had regrouped, with Darien leading them. They chose a clearing surrounded by dense trees, a favorable spot for an ambush. "He's coming," Darien said, gripping his sword tightly. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" "2 of us are already dead," one of the Black Frost 5 whispered. "He's seen your faces. He's 6 years old now, and already a monster. What happens in 10 years? Do you want to live the rest of your life waiting for him to come for your head?" Darien retorted. "How do you know he'll come alone?" another asked. The kid's been half-crazed lately, but it's just a chance. If he brings others, we'll continue retreating. Rigor emerged, running into view, his breathing heavy and his gaze fixed on the group. The three mercenaries took their positions, while others hidden in the trees waited for the right moment to strike. Finally alone? Are you? Darien taunted. Did you finish off your friends back there? Rigor's instinct screamed that something was wrong. He tried to stop, but it was too late. Arrows rained down from above. He used wind magic to deflect most, but one grazed his shoulder, and another embedded itself in his leg. He roared, snapping the arrow shaft before charging forward again. Darien advanced with two allies. One of them, a swordsman skilled in both the North God and Water God styles, unleashed swift, fluid strikes. Rigor dodged as best he could, but was struck on the flank by a shallow cut. Reacting quickly, he used earth magic to conjure a column of stone, forcing his opponent to back off. However, another mercenary attacked from the side, leaving Rigor surrounded on all fronts. His eyes sharpened like a predator's, his ears catching even the faintest sounds. The battle dragged on. Rigor possessed extraordinary vitality, but even he was beginning to feel exhaustion setting in. Sensing danger behind him, he spun around just in time, his heightened senses alerting him to an incoming strike. He cast his howling magic to gain a brief respite, but the mercenaries were prepared. Covering their ears, they pressed forward, and a diagonal sword slash tore across his back, leaving a searing pain that clouded his mind. Driven by pure survival instinct, Rigor retaliated with a sonic blast to his right, using the recoil to launch himself in the opposite direction. He collided with one of the mercenaries, the impact leaving him disoriented. He knew he was at a severe disadvantage, his body moving on sheer willpower as he desperately sought an opening. Rolling to the side, he contemplated using large-scale magic, but his dwindling mana made the idea impossible. He felt his reserves nearing depletion, forcing him to conserve what little he had left. Rigor stumbled, his body battered and covered in cuts and bruises. The taste of iron filled his mouth, and blood trickled down the side of his face. Breathing heavily, he remained defiant, his eyes blazing with both fury and determination. The three remaining mercenaries surrounded him with calculated precision. Darien stood at the front, his sword poised, while the other two flanked Rigor with deliberate steps. Still standing? Impressive, Darien sneered. Now that I think about it, wasn't your elven master's name Verdia? Verdia Solarion? If you survive, you might find an unpleasant surprise waiting for you. His cold smile cut deeper than any blade. Taking it as a provocation, Rigor flexed his knees, shifting into a defensive stance. He used water magic to clear the blood obscuring his left eye and activated his magic to track their subtle movements. One of the mercenaries made the first move, lunging with the long sword of silence, a sword god technique. Rigor countered with earth magic, creating a slight elevation beneath the enemy's feet, causing him to stumble. Seizing the opportunity, Rigor lunged and slashed diagonally with his claws, carving deep into the man's shoulder. The second mercenary wasted no time, launching a concealed North God attack from behind. The strike was devastating, but Rigor managed to raise a stone wall just in time. The force shattered the barrier, throwing him backward. Rigor collided with the trunk of a tree, the impact knocking the wind out of him. Before he could recover, Darien advanced, his blade gleaming with lethal intent. Rigor felt the cold grip of death as he sensed no escape. In desperation, he unleashed Fire Explosion, an advanced fire spell at point-blank range. The flames engulfed Darien, but the sheer force also sent Rigor hurtling backward. The forest clearing was illuminated by the explosion, and the shockwaves scattered the other mercenaries. Rigor landed hard, rolling across the ground, his body now covered in severe burns. Smoke curled from his charred skin as he rose, his monstrous physique the only thing keeping him standing. Darien emerged from the flames, limping and bleeding from multiple wounds. His leather armor was scorched, and half his body and face were burned beyond recognition, but he refused to fall. "You're a monster, kid," he rasped. Grinding his teeth, Rigger invoked mud magic, turning the ground beneath his enemies into a quagmire. The unstable footing caused two of them to lose their balance. Using wind magic to propel himself forward, Rigger targeted the swordsman, blending the sword god and water god styles. With a precise strike, he tore the man's throat open before he could recover from the mud. The body fell with a dull thud. Rigger turned to the next enemy, who had already escaped the quagmire. This mercenary employed advanced North God techniques, delivering a series of rapid, heavy strikes. Rigger dodged as best he could, but one slash caught his shoulder, cutting deep. Ignoring the pain, Rigger executed a risky grappling maneuver, slipping inside the mercenary's guard. He locked the man's neck in a leg hold while grabbing his sword hand with raw strength. With one sharp motion, Rigger finished him with a lethal claw to the throat. Now only Darien remained. Both combatants were bloody, exhausted, and on the brink of collapse. Darien, unable to escape, leaned on his sword for support. He smirked. "My team's at the training grounds, 500 meters that way," he said, pointing in a specific direction. Rigger stood silent, his breaths ragged as rage consumed his thoughts. "I thought I'd failed to kill Fendrell, and he'd end me, but I never imagined dying at your hands," Darien muttered, gazing at the overcast sky. Rigger advanced, picking up a fallen sword from the ground. "I wasn't lying about your master," Darien continued, his voice faltering. "The leader of our group, the North St. Kalinowski, was sent with a secondary mission to capture elven slaves. But his primary mission is to assassinate Rudeus Solarion. Seems your master upset the wrong people. Is that true?" Rigger growled. Darien coughed violently, blood staining his lips. "Yes, they're probably arriving as we speak. If you leave now, you might already be too late. But hey, tell Fendrell I'm sorry, will you?" Rigger said nothing, staring at Darien as he knelt in defeat. Lifting the sword, he brought it down, severing the man's head in one clean motion. With his mana almost depleted, Rigger used what little he had left to heal his most severe wounds. He headed to the location Darien had mentioned, freeing his captured allies. Healing Marla, the healer, he gave her instructions. "Tell my parents I'm heading to the Elven village. A North Saint is targeting Verdia. Protect our home. I'll return." Without waiting for a response, he turned and disappeared into the forest. He paused briefly, blood dripping from his hands, his mind still burning with the heat of battle. Darien's words echoed like a relentless drumbeat in his head. Looking back in the direction of his tribe, he hesitated. The fear of harming those he loved gnawed at him. He left his message and moved forward without hesitation, running through the dense woods. His silhouette faded into the night as his mind focused on one goal, saving Verdia. Chapter 11: The Light That Burns, the Darkness That Devours. POV: Rudeus Solarion. The hot wind swept through the devastated field, carrying the scent of scorched earth and dry leaves from what was once a vibrant, energetic clearing. Now, everything around her was a desolate landscape, reduced to a circle of destruction. The battle, which had raged on for over half a day, had taken its toll. The hurricane spell, a saint-level incantation, had been enough to scatter most of the remaining invaders, smugglers and mercenaries who dared attack the Elven village. However, it came at the cost of nearly all of Verdia's remaining mana. Leaning heavily on her staff, her arms trembled, and her breaths came in shallow gasps. The fatigue pulsed through her body, a stark reminder of her limitations. Despite her vast experience and power as a king-ranked mage, she was not invincible. Her body still had the vitality and resilience of her youthful elven years, but mana exhaustion was not something that willpower alone could overcome. That was impressive. A voice broke through the heavy silence, calm, yet laced with menace. Verdia lifted her gaze. About 20 meters away, an old man who looked to be in his 70s or 80s walked toward her with slow, deliberate steps. To the untrained eye, he appeared unremarkable. White hair, a deeply wrinkled face, a neatly trimmed beard, and plain clothes devoid of ornamentation. Only the short sword at his side hinted at the danger he posed. "It's over," the man declared, stopping at the edge of the ruined area. His gaze weighed on her like a blade. At this distance, killing you is as easy as slaughtering a rabbit. It doesn't matter if you're a saint level, king level, or even emperor level mage. All you mages are the same, fragile. Verdia tried to gather the strength to raise her staff, but she knew it would be futile. This man was no mere mercenary. From what little she could sense, he was at least at saint rank, more than capable of dispatching a mage before they could even begin a chant. Drawing on her experience, she quickly pieced together the truth. This man wasn't here by chance. "Who sent you after me?" she asked, her voice hoarse but steady. She needed time to think, time to understand. At the very least, she wanted to die knowing why. The old man smiled, a thin, cold expression. "An important noble from Meles," he said. 50 years ago, you and your band of adventurers killed his parents. Do you remember?" "Oh, of course you don't. You long-lived races always forget the people you crush along the way." But he remembers. He was just a child when you left him alive, a mistake that, in the end, became your undoing. Verdia felt a pang of recognition. During her adventuring days half a century ago, she had fought countless battles. Humans, monsters, other adventurers. The world was cruel, and mercy often came at a cost. She and her party had made decisions they believed were just at the time, but they had never considered the long-term consequences. 50 years, she murmured, more to herself than to him. "And here I am, the instrument of vengeance," he continued, drawing his sword with deliberate slowness. The metallic ring of the blade echoed ominously. "Let me introduce myself. I am Kalinowski Jerk, Saint of the North. You've lived for centuries, haven't you? You've probably gathered countless tales, achieved countless feats. But all of that ends here, at the hands of a man who wasn't even born when you were out conquering the world." Verdia closed her eyes for a moment, acknowledging the cruel irony. She had lived so long, seen so much, yet her journey would end here, at the hands of a human who, compared to the challenges she had faced, should have been insignificant. Her mind began to wander, revisiting the centuries of her life. She had been so young when she first ventured into the world, a talented but impulsive mage. Her adventuring companions, people who had become her family, were long gone now, claimed by time, violence, or both. After losing so many loved ones, she had closed herself off from the world. She became a distant observer, devoting herself to studying and preserving knowledge rather than forming new bonds. Why bother, when everyone she cared for would eventually die? But then, there was that boy, little Rigger. At first, she had only intended to ensure he was healthy and then leave. But something about the child had captivated her. His insatiable curiosity about the world, his unyielding desire to learn, and his startling talent were all remarkable. But those were secondary. What truly drew her to him was his perspective, his questions. When she and his mother told him stories, he asked things no one else would. Why does magic work? Where did it come from? If so many races are enslaved, why hasn't anyone tried to abolish slavery? If divine-level warriors are so strong, why don't they overthrow the Azuran nobility if they're so corrupt? Has anyone ever tried to tame monsters? It wasn't just curiosity. Rigger's questions were challenges, seeds of rebellion against the world's status quo. He didn't just seek answers, he sought change. Through the years spent with him, Verdia realized Rigger was a force of nature, a storm in the making. But more than that, he had accomplished something she had thought impossible. He had made her care again. She remembered the sparkle in his eyes whenever he learned something new, the way he turned stories into bold ideas for the future. He wasn't content to listen. He wanted to create something of his own. This boy will be the start of something extraordinary. But now, with Kalinowski closing in, Verdia doubted she would live to see Rigger reach his potential. Regret washed over her as she thought about how much more she could have taught and guided him. Kalinowski advanced, sword raised for the final blow. Verdia had no strength left to resist, no mana to defend herself. All she could do was close her eyes and wait for the inevitable. But the strike never came. A roar of fire split the air, a torrent of flames forcing Kalinowski to leap aside with remarkable speed. The heat of the flames scorched the air around Verdia, but she didn't care. "Master, are you all right?" Rigger's voice was deep, but carried a genuine note of concern. Verdia opened her eyes to see the young boy standing between her and the Saint of the North, his figure outlined by the glowing embers of the flames he had conjured. "Little Rigger," she murmured, emotions welling up inside her with such intensity that she couldn't even name them. "Be careful, Master. I'll need your support," he said firmly. MC's POV. Rigger sprinted at full speed, healing his wounds as his mana regenerated. His strength and stamina returned, even during his frantic dash. Upon arrival, he saw a few elves firing arrows at fleeing mercenaries. He quickly dispatched the attackers and demanded to know where Verdia's solar ion was. After getting a direction, he dashed off without a second thought. He silently thanked himself for his haste. His master was on the brink of death when he arrived. Without hesitation, he unleashed an advanced fire spell, Flame Lance, forcing the old man to retreat. It seemed to work. "Master, are you all right?" She looked exhausted, but her eyes lit up upon seeing him, likely a mix of relief and gratitude for being spared from certain death. However, the situation was grim. Rigger had never defeated Fendrel, and if this saint was as strong as him, he would need help to kill him. For now, he just needed to catch the enemy off guard. He would make him underestimate his abilities. "Little Rigger," Verdia murmured softly. "Still calling me little?" Rigger thought, but chose not to say it aloud. "Be careful, Master. I'll need your support." The tower they were in was spacious, but fighting here was still dangerous for his master. Rigger quickly scanned his surroundings, analyzing the terrain. Kalinowski maintained a relaxed posture, but the gleam in his eyes betrayed his sharp focus. He was evaluating every movement Rigger made. "You seem strong, kid," Kalinowski said, casually twirling his short sword with fluid skill. "It'll be a shame to kill such raw talent." Rigger gripped his sword tightly, the blade he had taken from Darien, and activated his magic eye. The world around him seemed to slow for an instant, and he caught Kalinowski's faint movement before the man even executed it. The flow of battle aura around him was eerily similar to Fendrel's. Rigger couldn't afford to lose focus now. Kalinowski lunged with an explosion of speed, closing the distance in the blink of an eye. His sword sliced horizontally, aiming for Rigger's torso. Rigger reacted instinctively, parrying the blow with his sword and twisting his body to the right, using his strength to push Kalinowski back. The old man was shockingly agile, but he lacked Rigger's brute force. "He's fast, but if I can trap him in a bad position, I can overpower him." The sound of rustling leaves drew Kalinowski's attention. Too late, he noticed Verdia's arrow flying toward him. He spun around, deflecting it with his sword, but the impact distracted him for a crucial moment. Rigger charged in, attempting to disarm Kalinowski with a vertical strike. But Kalinowski smirked. "Do you know who you're fighting, boy?" Suddenly, his sword vanished, not in a flash of magic, but in a blur of speed so precise that the blade seemed invisible. Rigger felt the air slice near his face and instinctively leaped back. He barely avoided the strike, but the edge still left a clean cut across his forehead, sending blood spraying. "What was that?" Rigger gasped, quickly healing the wound. "No one becomes a saint without skill, Brad." Before Rigger could fully process his opponent's technique, Kalinowski was on him again. His sword, now seemingly invisible, slashed in unpredictable directions. Only Rigger's magic eye, which vaguely perceived the flow of mana, saved him from fatal blows. Even so, small cuts began to accumulate on his arms and legs as he narrowly evaded. "Damn it," Rigger muttered. He needed to catch Kalinowski off guard with magic. Looking at the nearby trees, an idea struck him. "Master, keep up the pressure with arrows," he called out. "Be careful, Rigger. Northern God-style users always have a hidden trick," Verdia warned. She unleashed a flurry of arrows. Kalinowski dodged them with ease, leaping to avoid a strike from Rigger. His jump took him to a tree branch overlooking the clearing. Surprise flickered across his face when a well-placed arrow shattered the branch beneath him. Rigger capitalized on his fall, swinging a lateral strike that would have cleaved Kalinowski in two. But the Saint twisted midair, using the force of the blow to propel himself into a safer position, barely escaping. Even so, Rigger's strike cratered the ground, sending debris flying in all directions, some of which grazed Kalinowski. What absurd strength! Kalinowski muttered, slightly impressed. Rigger didn't let the opening slip away. He retreated toward the trees, forcing Kalinowski to follow. This is getting fun, boy. What other tricks do you have? The old man taunted. The dense forest restricted Kalinowski's movements, making it harder for him to use his invisible sword technique effectively. The Saint attacked again. The two clashed as they moved through the dense vegetation, roots and vines slowing them down. Rigger deliberately used the terrain to his advantage, a strategy that didn't go unnoticed by his opponent. You're clever, boy, but still too green. Kalinowski suddenly hurled his sword at Rigger, who barely dodged it. In the same instant, the Saint drew two short blades and lunged low, aiming for Rigger's ankles. Rigger evaded, but a stray root caused him to stumble, leaving him vulnerable. A deep cut slashed his left leg. "Ag! Got you!" Kalinowski shouted, going in for the kill. Before the blade could reach him, a single arrow whizzed past, grazing Kalinowski's head. It was just enough to disrupt his attack, sparing Rigger from a fatal throat wound. "Master!" Rigger called out, grateful. Rudeus, hidden behind a tree, knocked another arrow with precision. Despite her exhaustion, her aim was steady. Rigger seized the moment to counterattack, extended his hand, whispering a spell, Sonic Burst. A sudden gale hurled Kalinowski backward, slamming him into a tree. His surprise was evident as he collided, momentarily losing his orientation. Rigger didn't waste a chance. He invoked earth spikes, summoning jagged stone pillars beneath the Saint. Kalinowski reacted with monkey-like agility, leaping away, but the spikes tore through his torso and left leg. The old man laughed through the pain. "Ha! Chantless magic." Rigger gave him no time to rest. The two clashed fiercely among the trees, each aiming for vital points throughout the battle. Rigger used his strength and magic to press the North Saint into a corner, while Kalinowski relied on his technique and experience to try to maintain control, though his bleeding leg and torso hindered his movement significantly. The battle was starting to shift in Rigger's favor. He could tell Kalinowski was slowing down, and his magic was beginning to predict the old man's movements. Just one decisive strike. Rigger thought, panting but resolute. He kept his breathing steady, even as sweat dripped down his face. His body was covered in cuts and scratches, and he was starting to feel dizzy. His strikes grew more erratic, and his senses blurred. It didn't take long for him to identify his condition. Damn it, poison? Kalinowski, on the other hand, was also showing signs of exhaustion. His technique was still impeccable, but his movements had lost their fluidity. Rudeus, hiding among the trees, carefully adjusted her bowstring. Even with her evident fatigue, she knew she couldn't stop. Each arrow she fired served to keep the North Saint under pressure and provide Rigger with much-needed openings. "Are you immune to poison, kid? You should have been on the ground by now," Kalinowski shouted, his voice laced with mockery as he backed away slightly. "You two are more persistent than I expected," he said, his tone heavy with frustration. "But this little game ends now." With a swift motion, Kalinowski stomped his enchanted boot against the ground, activating a series of magical runes beneath him. A blast of wind erupted, sending dust and leaves flying as he propelled himself high into the air. "Master, watch out!" Rigger shouted, using a gust of wind magic to propel himself forward in a desperate attempt to intercept. When the dust settled, Kalinowski was perched on a tree branch near Rudeus. In one fluid motion, he leapt down with both short swords aimed at her. The air rippled dangerously as he closed the distance. "The boy's tough, but if I complete my mission, this will be worth it." Rigger screamed in desperation, bounding between the trees with all his might. He knew he wouldn't make it in time. What kind of boots are those? A magical item? He wondered briefly before realizing he had no other choice. If he couldn't close the gap physically, He'd have to gamble everything on one move. Even if it didn't work, it might be enough to save his master. He lacked the time to cast a spell, so he theorized that he could channel the magic directly into his sword. A technique like Flame Slice would be perfect. With a quick motion, Rigger poured his mana into his blade. Intense flames erupted around it, forming a blazing arc that illuminated the devastated clearing. Kalinowski caught sight of the flames in the corner of his vision and calculated quickly. He believed he could still kill Verdia and dodge the incoming attack. He didn't slow down. Verdia threw herself backward, trying to avoid Kalinowski's blade, as Rigger timed his strike for the last possible second. Flame Slice. Rigger swung his blade in a fluid arc, releasing a fiery crescent that surged forward like a blazing bolt of lightning. The heat was so intense it made the air ripple visibly. Kalinowski tried to evade at the last moment, but it was too late. The fiery blade struck his side, sending him flying backward with an explosive impact. He crashed into a massive tree, splitting its thick trunk nearly in half. A cauterized wound ran deep across his torso. Rigger held his stance for a moment, panting heavily as the flames around his sword gradually subsided. The North Saint was still alive, but barely. Blood dripped from his mouth as he leaned against the cracked tree, a faint smile on his face. "Got killed by a kid? Hey, brat, make sure you tell people I was the first Saint-level opponent you defeated. That'll give me some fame in the afterlife." Kalinowski coughed, blood splattering with his words. "I didn't expect to find such a gem at the end of my life. If we'd been on the same side, I'd have loved to teach you the way of the sword." His voice grew weaker until his eyes finally lost their light. Rigger turned to his master. "Are you hurt, master?" he asked urgently. Verdia, still catching her breath, gave him a faint smile as she glanced at his battered and bloodied body. "Not a scratch," she replied, her tone light despite the exhaustion in her voice. With the North Saint defeated, Rigger and Verdia hurried back to the elven village. When they arrived, the sight was sobering. Though there hadn't been many casualties thanks to their efforts, each loss was deeply felt. The surviving elves were already working together to rebuild what they had lost. The village leader approached them with reverence, bowing deeply. "We couldn't have survived without you," he said, gratitude filling his voice. Rigger, however, seemed distracted. He glanced at Verdia, who was clearly exhausted but still standing. "Master, are you okay?" "Yes, little Rigger," Verdia replied with a soft smile, though her face betrayed her fatigue. "What about your tribe? How are they?" Rigger hesitated, his expression growing somber. Memories of his last actions before leaving flashed through his mind, and he felt a pang of guilt. "Master, can I stay here in the elven village for a while?" he asked anxiously. Verdia seemed surprised but nodded. "Of course, Rigger. Stay as long as you need, but send a letter home. All right?" Rigger nodded. He had much to think about and even more to do.